Let's head out to the progressive guest line right now. Continue the conversation about the Suns and the NBA as the Phoenix Suns reach the NBA Finals for the first time since 1993. Chris Paul, of course, goes to the NBA Finals for the first time in his career at age 36. And now joining us on the progressive guest line is the host of the Locked On NBA podcast, also covers the Rockets for Locked On. He is Jackson Gatlin, and he joins us now. Jackson, my man, appreciate the time. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. It's great to see Chris Paul thriving and successful. My question for you, Jake, is should the Knicks have made a play for Chris Paul? Because apparently that man can lead a team to the finals.
It's amazing, right? I mean, it's unbelievable watching it. And then last night in particular, Jackson, I mean, for him to go out there and score 41 points, 31 in the second half, you've seen a lot of Chris Paul's games, of course, up close with the Rockets for 2 seasons. Do you think that was arguably the best game of his career last night?
I think it has to be. He matches his playoff career high, a career high that he had when he clinched his first trip to the Western Conference Finals after kind of, finally passing that milestone in his career with the Houston Rockets as a Houston Rocket. Dropped 41 against the Jazz in Game 5 to clinch that series a couple of years ago. Does it again to clinch Game 6 last night to make his way to the finals for the very first time. And look, this is a guy that got completely written off by the fans, by the media, and he completely turned it around after being shipped out of Houston. Credit to Chris Paul. Went vegan, went plant-based, completely revitalized his body, and now he's in the NBA Finals. He put the work in, and you're seeing the results.
What does it do for his legacy now that at the minimum he's at least gone to the NBA Finals?
The legacies are so tough because you get into, debates between different eras of basketball and all that. But I mean, you have people out there that regard him as, sometimes the third greatest point guard to ever play, and he hasn't even won a title yet. He's called the point god for a reason. I think that making it to the finals, it does move the needle a little bit for him, but I think he's got to come away with a chip, especially considering how many of the other teams that are, between the Bucks and the Hawks, both of those teams are dealing with injuries. Neither are 100%. This is his best shot to win a title, so he's got to come away with it.
Jackson Gatlin joining us here. He's the host of the Locked On NBA podcast, also the host of the Locked On Rockets podcast, of course, covering the Houston Rockets. You look at the landscape for the playoffs right now, Jackson. I mean, can you talk about the irony of all these star players going down, helping the Suns' path to get to the finals? And, of course, it's Chris Paul, who for years, as every Rocket fan knows well, has dealt with some, excruciating injuries come playoff time.
Yeah, I mean, you got it just, the hamstring injury is the one that immediately comes to mind for Rockets fans. But Chris Paul has had some of the worst luck throughout his career when it comes to injuries. And finally, he gets an opportunity. And to be fair to Chris, he made it through this postseason with his fair share of injuries, right? He's battling through a wrist injury right now. He had the shoulder injury to start the playoffs. And everybody thought, okay, here's round one against the Lakers. The Suns are the higher seeded team. But here goes Chris Paul with another injury, and he's not going to be able to deliver in the postseason. But then he comes back from the shoulder injury. He's a little banged up, but comes back, makes his presence felt. They top the Lakers. And from that moment on, suddenly it looked like he was, going to be okay. But then he gets COVID and has to sit out the first 2 games of the conference finals. He finally makes it back after 2 years, only his second trip in his career to the conference finals. And the dude gets COVID. So you're really like scratching your head thinking he really can't get a break. But thankfully, we got to see him play 4 healthy games. It was a little rusty those first couple games back, but really picked it up in games 5 and 6 and, put away the Clippers.
Jackson Gatlin with us here talking NBA with him. You look at the Rockets and Chris Paul. I mean, you have to imagine, knowing Chris Paul, the person he is, how vindictive he could be, that he is just saying to himself, man, it could not have gone any better. The Rockets are the worst record in the NBA. James Harden gets knocked out in the second round. And here's Chris Paul in the NBA Finals. How do you think he's feeling deep down inside when he looks at what's happened with Houston and James Harden?
Oh, you got to know he's probably smiling ear to ear because I firmly believe that we may not have seen Chris Paul, with this level of a resurgence had he not been traded and right. Houston paid to trade him, right? 2 first round picks, 2 pick swaps. Imagine being Chris Paul, the competitor that he is, who, let's face it, I said this today in a show, that Chris Paul is probably, he's probably the most competitive player in the league now that Kobe is gone. Obviously, God rest his soul. But now that Chris Paul is the most competitive guy in the league. So for you to go to him and say, you know what, you're not good enough anymore, you're washed, we're going to actually pay to give up future assets to get rid of you, that absolutely had to light a fire under him. And alongside the plant-based diet and everything, I think that the spite more than anything is what led to his resurgence and him, getting back into this elite level where he was able to, take the Thunder to the playoffs and then facilitate a trade with Sam Presti to the Phoenix Suns. And now he's in the finals. And you got to understand, there have been some post-game interviews that he's done where he's talked about, yeah, man, people were writing me off. They said I was washed. And those are clearly shots at the Houston Rockets because that was the organization that thought he was done for.
Jackson Gatlin with us here talking NBA with him. You can follow him on Twitter at JT Gatlin. As far as the Clippers now, Jackson, obviously without Kawhi, it was going to be really tough for them to win this series, but they battled. They did force a game 6. Where do they go from here, though? How does this exit in the conference finals and Kawhi getting hurt, how does that impact ultimately his decision on whether or not he'll opt out?
So I think Kawhi opting out is probably just a foregone conclusion, but not because he's going to leave. I think it's just he's going to opt out and then he'll re-sign for his max deal. I believe, if memory serves, I think he's right at the 10-year mark, so he can get his 10 years NBA service level contract, get that gigantic 4 or 5 year deal, whatever he wants. Maybe this does a little bit of something for him where he thinks, you know what, yeah, this team fought, they battled, they played 8 really great games without me. And, if I was there healthy, maybe we push the Suns to 7, or maybe we even take the series, because, they just didn't have the right amount of healthy bodies, to push the Suns. But I do think that above anything else, what this kind of postseason did for Paul George is it really does show that playoff P or pandemic P, we can put that nickname to rest, because even though he had a rough game 6, that man delivered repeatedly in the absence of Kawhi Leonard. He stepped up to the plate in a big way, averaged almost 30 a game since Kawhi went down, playing like 42 minutes a night, led the NBA in playoff minutes per game and total minutes played in the playoffs. And I really don't want anybody, that's my kind of takeaway from the Clippers is, I don't want anybody to try and slander PG after last night's performance. He has been absolutely deserving of praise and should get his flowers. And we should probably put the pandemic P stuff to rest, at least for a little while.
Without Giannis tonight, Jackson, do you think the Bucks can win a game 5 at home?
I think that the Hawks are actually the better equipped team to deal with missing their star, right? Because you look at Trey and you look at Giannis and what they provide to their respective teams. And this isn't like a disservice to Trey. It's just there's very few people who do what Giannis does on either side of the court. You can't just replicate that. I know they've got Giannis's little brother over there, but he's not Giannis. And, they can't just trot him out there and say, all right, go do what your brother does. Otherwise, they'd have a pair of MVPs on their team. I think that the Hawks actually have a better shot because their lineup is better able to kind of make up or kind of split the difference, if you know what I mean, when it comes to the absence of their star player. So I'm actually feeling Hawks tonight.
Feeling Hawks. I like it. All right. So looking ahead to the NBA Finals, we know the Suns are going to be favored in whichever matchup. It complicates things with the Bucks because we don't know the status of Giannis, but who do you think the Suns would actually prefer to face?
I think it's clear they'd probably prefer to face the Hawks. I think you're right. They're going to be favored whichever matchup, whichever team comes out of the Eastern Conference, but probably Hawks. They're the younger team. They're the slightly more inexperienced team. But at the end of the day, the Hawks have totally proven that they deserve to be, in the discussion, right? This isn't an accident. This isn't a fluke. But with those injuries, both to Trey and Giannis, it definitely gives the Suns a hand up on whoever comes out of the Eastern Conference.
All right. As far as the team you cover up close, Jackson, second pick in the draft, what's the What's the fan base one? Or is the fan? It seems like just looking at Twitter, the fan base is very split on who the pick should be at number 2. What would you do if you were running the Rockets?
Look, I'm still firmly on Evan Mobley Island, a proud member of the Mobley mob. We've got our different factions separated in the Rockets Twitter sphere. We got the Mobley mob, we got the Jalen Green gang, and then we've got the Jalen Suggs squad. So the Suggs squad one, that one's kind of a distant third. But you're right. I mean, Rockets fandom is kind of divided right down the middle on these two guys. And the reason for that is both of these guys are elite prospects, right? And this is kind of the best part, is it's not the fandom being divided and saying, oh, well, you're wrong for XYZ reasons. It's, I just, both guys are great. I'd be happy with either guy, but I just prefer this guy because of, these handful of reasons. And that's a great spot to be in, right? To be able to have these debates and nobody's going at, nobody's, coming at your throat or anything, trying to say you're wrong. This is the right pick for no. It's a healthy debate because there's so much talent at the top of this draft. And you've got Cade Cunningham, Evan Mobley, Jalen Green, Suggs, Kuminga. I mean, you really can't go wrong with whatever direction. The crazy thing is we might look back on this draft like 3 or 4 years from now and be like, oh, wow, Jalen Suggs was the best option out of all of them. I think this one's going to feel very similar to the 2018 draft where you come away from it thinking, wow, every team hit on a gem at the top of the draft, and all of those guys are now developing and really delivering for their respective teams.
Finally, is there any chance Cade Cunningham doesn't go 1 to the Pistons? What are your thoughts on that?
Man, Jake, there's a lot of smoke coming out of Detroit, and we've got a history with Troy Weaver where, he's a guy that likes to go a bit against the grain, kind of a maverick. And it wouldn't entirely shock me if there, where there's smoke, there's a little bit of fire. And if the Pistons did ultimately decide that they prefer Jalen Green, they want the ball in Killian Hayes' hands moving forward. If that's the case, then I'm sure that they're going to pick up the phone, reach out to Rafael Stone and the Houston Rockets and say, hey, what does a trade down look like for us? Because it's important to note the Rockets actually own the Detroit Pistons first round pick for like the next decade because of the protections they put on it. They can't trade any firsts all the way through like 2029 because of the protections they put on their first round pick that the Rockets currently own. So that's a strong bargaining chip if you're Rafael Stone and the Rockets.
He's Jackson Gatlin. Once again, follow him on Twitter at JT Gatlin. He's the host of the Locked On NBA podcast. He also does a daily Locked On podcast all about the Houston Rockets. Jackson, appreciate the time, my friend. Thanks for coming on.
Always a pleasure, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Jackson with us there on the Progressive guest line, quoting home insurance. It's got easier with Progressive's Home Quote Explorer. Quote and buy online at progressive.com. Quick break, and we come right back. Wrap up hour 1 of 2 on a Thursday. This is the Jake Asman Show here on Sports Map Radio.
The Jake Asman Show.
One more Chipotle tip because I'm in a given mood. If you're getting a